Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Starfest Presents Omar Mouallem. I'm Michelle Steinhusen. I'm the festival director. And as a library, we are all about sharing stories, and we're very privileged to share the amazing Starfest authors and stories from Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. This is a virtual event, but we do want it to be an interactive event. So please put any comments or questions in the chat. There will be time for your questions to get answered throughout the evening. So you want to make sure you change your chat settings to everyone instead of hosts and panelists if you want to share your comments with everybody who's attending. If you haven't had a chance to purchase Omar's book, Praying to the West, we will put links to Audrey's books and Glass Bookshop in the comments a few times throughout the evening. And we do have Omar's book at the library, but it is completely checked out because everybody wants to read this book. I am going to bring in now the people you are actually here to see, which is not me. Here is Omar, here is Zain. I will introduce both these gents and then I will pop off. And we're going to have a very, very interesting evening tonight, I'm sure. Okay, so Omar is an award-winning writer and filmmaker. He's reported on Muslim and Middle Eastern issues for The Guardian, The Ringer, and Wired, and co-authored the national bestseller, Inside the Inferno, a firefighter's story of the brotherhood that saved Fort McMurray. Besides his new book, Omar's most recent project has been directing The Last Baron, a documentary about the unlikely connection between the Lebanese Civil War and a rogue burger chain. This burger chain was a popular hangover spot for a certain someone in her youth.
Just my youth?
Yes, just my youth. In 2020, he founded Pandemic University School of Writing, which is a pop-up writing school for and by lockdown and quarantine writers. I took a look at their website today. Very, very cool. And we're putting Omar in the hands of Zain Velji. Zain was named one of Calgary's top 40 under 40 by Avenue Magazine. And I actually cut his bio down because I was starting to feel really inadequate by what I had done with my life. So this is a shortened version. Zain is a frequent public speaker and regular political commentator who appears weekly on CBC radio and television and co-hosting the 2019 federal election for CTV. Zain's consulting and political experience has allowed him to work for companies and nonprofits, as well as notable political campaigns. We can see the poster behind you. You served as campaign manager for Calgary Mayor Nenshi in 2017 and worked on campaigns for U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren and U.S. President Barack Obama. Zain is also the host of the award-winning podcast, The Strategists, where he dissects political strategy and public affair issues of the day. I'm going to hand things over now to Omar and Zain to take us on a journey of self-discovery. And I'd like to invite everyone again, please put your comments and your questions in the chat throughout the whole evening. So, gentlemen, I leave it to you.
It's too bad Michelle cut out the part about your work for Mitch McConnell's campaign.
Yeah, I mean, it's the proudest work. Moscow Mitch and I, let me tell you something. We go ways back, and it is it's some of the work that I don't get to talk about enough.
I talk about it for you all the time.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. Do you want to flip this around? Because I'm happy to do the interview. Hope you're doing well, brother. Thanks for
thank you, man. Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah,
I wish we were doing this in person.
That'd be a lot of fun. But this is gonna be good. And thank you to everyone who's attending from wherever you are in this province, in this country. First of all, congratulations on this book, man. I read it thoroughly. I was impressed by the writing. It was thoughtful. It was provocative in certain chapters. I'm curious about many things. But before we get going into the depths of the book, perhaps you can do a reading of maybe a section of the book. Start us off there, and we'll use that as maybe a starting off point to our conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I never get the opportunity as a journalist to do readings, so it's kind of nice having a book out and having this privilege. I'm going to read from somewhere near the end from the chapter about the Quebec City Mosque. The book is written as a sort of a profile of 13 remarkable mosques. And obviously the Quebec City Mosque tells us a lot, I think, about the current state of Islamophobia. So let me read to you from that. About 15 minutes before the killer fired at them, his first two victims, Mamadou Tanu Berry and Ibrahimi Berry, stood shoulder to shoulder in prayer. They'd come to mosque together after paying respects to their friend who just lost his father. The Berries, though unrelated, were inseparable. Both civil servants, both fathers of young children, they were close in age and lived in the same apartment building a few kilometers from the mosque, often carpooling together to prayer. Since meeting in Quebec City, they were more like brothers than friends. They'd leaned on each other many times. When Ibrahimi's wife's health started declining, when Mamadou's father died and it became incumbent on him to support his extended family, and they leaned on each other one last time as they walked to their cars in the dark after Aisha prayer. They saw the shooter's rifle pointed at them in the parking lot. They slipped on the ice, trying to back away. As they scrambled to get away in the snow, the shooter pulled the trigger. The semi-automatic .223 caliber rifle jammed. Nothing fired. They might have felt the slightest relief until he fished that handgun from his pocket. He shot Mamadou and Ibrahimi in the snow, walked up to their bodies, and shot each one once more. To some of the 39 men and children inside the prayer hall, milling about and socializing after Salah, after prayer, those first pops sounded like someone was throwing rocks at the windows. Because that did sometimes happen, the mosque had bulked up security, including installing doors programmed to automatically lock 15 minutes before prayer and lock 15 minutes after. But 15 minutes had not yet passed. For those pulling on their shoes by the front door, the sight of the two men bleeding on the pavement left little confusion. As they registered the killer standing over the Berries, some dashed downstairs to the cleaning stations, others into the prayer hall, not realizing they trapped themselves. Fathers and uncles hurried to scoop up the children sitting near the archway. One sporadically ran across the carpet while the shooter emptied the magazine into the prayer hall. He took cover behind an archway, reloading it as if he were under attack. Over the next 90 seconds, he'd continue acting like someone in combat, charging in and out of the prayer hall, running between the archways, reloading 5 times. Ayman Durbali hid behind structural pillars along with pharmacist Aboubakar Thabti, a Tunisian Canadian. He came to Canada to study and decided to stay. Thabti was famous for his work ethic. He slept little, working 2 jobs day and night except on Sundays. With his 1 night off per week, the 44-year-old husband and father of 2 attended Aisha prayers and stayed behind to catch up with friends. Another victim was IT consultant Abdul Karim Hassan. The Algerian immigrant had just returned to his job with the provincial government after 3 months of parental leave. He was an ever-sensitive and doting father. His eldest children would wait for him to come home all night, refusing to sleep until his warmth returned to comfort them, and it never did. Most who huddled in an open storage room right of the mihrab survived, but the alcove couldn't shelter everyone. A bullet entered Khalid Belkacemi, killing one of Quebec's most renowned food scientists. Khalid's life had revolved around academia. He arrived from Algeria in the 1980s with a bachelor's in chemical engineering, earned a PhD from Sherbrooke University, became a researcher emeritus at Laval University, and advanced food and health safety for his adopted country. It became clear that the assailant would not run out of ammunition soon. As Adine Soufiane tried to band together men to fight back, Soufiane was like a godfather to the whole community. The Moroccan had come to Canada years earlier to study geology, but he'd found more success as Quebec City's first halal butcher. Business in his shop grew steadily along with the community, and he served as a touch point for newcomers still learning to navigate the city and country. The 57-year-old father of three never missed an opportunity to help guide newcomers to the right services. He became one of Ayman's closest friends as the pair socialized and worked together on a charity they co-founded for Palestinian orphans. Soufiane would be hailed a hero that night. Unable to recruit others, he alone tackled the killer, pinning him against the wall. The assailant rapidly shot at Soufiane, sending him back toward a pillar, where he collapsed by Derbali's legs. The image of his dying friend is one of the last things Ayman recalled from that night. The rest he'd recall from surveillance tapes played before testifying against the man who paralyzed him. When Derbali saw the gunman make a run for the alcove, he pounced on him, tackling the killer 3 times and taking 7 bullets in the process, including the one still in his spinal cord. The shooter tried to end Derbali's life and faith simultaneously, but only ended up intensifying his resolve for both. He still tries to make it to the mosque for daily prayers. However, what was once a 5-minute drive from his home is now a half-hour bus commute. It's just not possible anymore. When I start to think about not being able to pray like the others, he told me, I just think I'm miraculous to be alive after receiving 7 bullets. I accept this destiny. Thanks.
Wow. Powerful. I mean, and amazingly descriptive, harrowing. You know, and you almost look at some of the folks, and maybe we'll start here as a jumping off point, who were directly and indirectly impacted by the Quebec City mosque shooting, and their defiance and their advocacy to not stop praying, to not stop attending that physical space. To me, in some regards, I kind of saw your book as an act of kind of advocacy and defiance, pushing back against something. And I've heard in other interviews where you've talked about the state of affairs that kind of maybe were one of the reasons why you emerged and with this book and the idea for this book. Can you talk to me about what the genesis was for you to put this work together?
I think I just got tired of seeing anti-Muslim hate get worse and worse. You know, it was, you know, it was in some ways easy to ignore because of the set of events that 9/11 had put in motion. And so I think I lived most of my life accepting that Islamophobia, some degree of it, is always going to be there. But it's not going to affect my life very much. And it's not going to be, you know, it's not something that I'm going to have to, you know, sit and think about often. Well, that all changed in around 2015, 2016. It was just this confluence of things that it's just a maelstrom of events and changes in the world. You had the rise of Trump, right? And the Muslim ban that he proposed, and also a Muslim registry that he proposed. People forget about that. You had the backlash to Syrian refugees. You had the surge of ISIS-inspired events and ISIS attackers across Europe and the Middle East. You had the twilight of the Harper administration and them staking their final, you know, campaign for their after their final term on just, you know, blatant Islamophobia and stoking the flames of Islamophobia. And I think this is maybe the biggest one. It was sort of this new era of social media as sort of news provider and as sort of a place to express your controversial opinions across the political spectrum. But for a lot of people who I think had been harboring anti-Muslim sentiments for a long time, they were receiving license from public figures, and they now had this very accessible platform to express it. And so I think it just sort of, all these things came together and it became unignorable. And it reached the point where I was starting to, experience Islamophobic slurs, which is in Edmonton, which is not something that I experienced much in my life.
Really?
Yeah. There was about three experiences in about a year. They were all random white dudes. There was also, and sometimes people sort of on the edge of society and troubled people, but that doesn't make it any more anomalous. Those people have always, existed in my community. So, why now was I being confronted with that? Things like my parents' mosques or my parents' neighborhood receiving like really hateful brochures in mailboxes around them. There was a Soldiers of Odin rally. So Soldiers of Odin is a notorious anti-Muslim hate group just right here by my house. And there was also an ISIS attack or an ISIS inspired attack, I should say, also right by my house as well. So like I said, it just became unignorable. And I think also, a lot of the anti-Muslim Islamophobic talking points were ones that were familiar to me because they were thoughts that I've had myself. I used to be, a pretty vocal anti-religious person, one of those new atheist douchebags. And so I think there was a feeling maybe that I was a little bit complicit in it. And I wanted to do, I just wanted to do something. And this, I guess, was my something.
Was perhaps your atonement or making amends, kind of your contribution to that counter narrative.
In a sense. And I think one of the biggest misconception is that Islam is one thing, that it is a monolith, that if two people from a global population of 1.8 billion believe the same things, because they have the same holy book at their disposal, which is just absolutely insane. I mean, it is such a rich, diverse religion with so many denominations, so many different cultural inflections, personal inflections. And then when you move it into the Western context and you add sort of the nuances and influences of their particular region, whether that be Edmonton or the Caribbean, it is a completely unique form of practice.
100%. And you talk about Islamic pluralism, which I want to get to, but let me leave this bracket open for a second in regards to the genesis of the book and kind of go to the process, which was, it ended up being a book. And the reason I say it like that is because, as Michelle introduced, you're a filmmaker, you've done magazine contributions, you've done long form, you've done interviews. Why the decision for a book? Because when I read this, I could sense some of the folks that you talked to in a sense that this could have been a documentary film that Omar did, or this could have been an exceptional podcast series. Why the choice for a book, which I will say that in many Islamic contexts has been reserved for theology or academia, barring a few sort of memoir style. And there's a bit of memoir here, but in terms of your documentation, why the choice of a book? As simple as that question sounds, given all the options available for someone with your skill set, I'm curious.
I'll give you a simple answer. Filmmaking, I do have a background in film, but I did not actually return to filmmaking until 2018. At that point, this book was well underway. I started writing this book, researching and traveling for this book in 2017. I think the other reason too is that I don't know if this would have been made if it were. I mean, just think about what it takes to put together a podcast or a film. It's not something that one person can do. If I was lugging around gear, I would probably need someone else. I would need to build a team. It becomes infinitely more expensive, and it's already an expensive book that I traveled 10,000 kilometers for. It probably cost me personally $20,000 on travel alone, maybe more. That would probably be, $200,000 if we were making a docu-series. So, in the end, I think that the only way this could have been made was as a book. Now, just because it is literature doesn't mean that it can't be accessible. It can't be, just because it's nonfiction doesn't mean it can't be accessible, can't be rendered in vivid ways. I've heard the term for this kind of journalism, Marcello D'Acincio, another great author from Alberta in Calgary. Yeah. He uses this term documentary journalism, which I quite like, and I think that is what I unintendedly did here.
And for the root of my question was really about, when we talk about Islam and often this big heady thing, there's a lot of sensitivities about it. There's sensitivities by some of the folks in this book for you talking about their community, their practice, frankly, their place, has been almost reserved for theology and academia. And so to have, this documentary journalism kind of competing with it side by side with the spine right next to it in that same category, I think is fascinating when you try to construct new narratives or push back against more mainstream narratives in the zeitgeist that you might be experiencing. But there's a quote
I hope so. Because you're right about that. Like there are a lot of scholarly books written on the subject of Islamic pluralism and theology, but because I read a lot of those books for this, and they have their place, but I would not have read them had I not had a job to do here. I mean, they're very difficult to access mentally. They're very inaccessible.
Yeah, 100% agree. And one of the points that I loved, I think a quote you gave recently, was that you said this book was not a celebration of Islam, but a normalization of it.
Yeah.
A normalization of it. This was not a book to just say that if there is a narrative of bubbling up Islamophobia, the best thing we could do is just blast it or celebrate. And that might be other people's lane.
Yeah, totally. No, there's a place for that. There is absolutely a place for that. There's a place for overcorrecting when you have something like this. We see that in a lot of issues. So, for example, for many, many, many years, there was an enormous burden put on sexual assault victims, mostly women, to sort of prove their innocence. We are currently seeing an overcorrection where there is more of a burden on the alleged predators to prove their innocence, and sometimes that can that can possibly lead to a miscarriage of justice, but we maybe need that overcorrection to sort of change the zeitgeist. So there is a place for that, but that has existed for a while. There have been a lot of very positive sort of counter narratives about Muslim people for quite a while. Little Mosque on the Prairie. I think that premiered on television over a decade ago, right? And a number of television shows and movies and books. But I'm a journalist, and I don't go out to promote anything. I just try to find the truth in things, and normalizing Islam, maybe another way of saying it is neutralizing it. Doesn't mean showing that it is showing that Muslim people are somehow better than their Christian neighbors or not. It's showing that they are no better or worse. That showing that having a mosque in your community is no better or worse than having a church or a synagogue in your community, that there are benefits and there may not be, that there are going to be, there are still going to be conflicts within communities, issues that they have to ventilate. The difference with this book, though, is that I hope that I've given the stage and ceded space to Muslim people to air out whatever issues or conflicts are going on in their communities, to speak to it themselves. as opposed to having other people, speak around them about them, those kinds of like outside criticisms. Because, I think that is just a opportunity that maybe they're not given enough of. Often in Muslim narratives about Muslim people, it is the narrator is sort of talking around them. It is, whereas this, I hoped, allows them to be more actors instead of spectators in the story of Muslim people in this part of the world and in Muslim history.
You mentioned this off the top, 13 mosques that you highlight. The subtitle of the book, How Muslims Shaped the Americas. I guess the question I have for you is when you went in researching where you wanted to go, did you have a sense of how Muslims had shaped the Americas? And was it a reverse engineering of saying, this is where I think there might be good meat on the bone to highlight it? I'm kind of curious about a process question. I'm kind of curious about the process, I guess, in a sense, because you and I know as people who prescribe to the faith in whatever different way, right? Like that it's finding pluralism for us is very easy to do. Finding diversity within our faith is very easy to do. So what was kind of your compass to finding the 13 places of worship, so to speak, and thereby extension the communities and people for this book?
I started with what I thought was a solid history of Islam in the West, of Muslim people's influences in the West. And, I think before I had this idea for the book, if I were asked to do the same thing, I probably would have started quite ethnocentrically with Lebanese immigrants of the late 1800s. Some distant relatives of mine who were a part of starting the first purpose-built mosque in Canada, the Al Rashid, and many of the first mosques on the in North America were also on the prairies, and that's fascinating in its own right. But as soon as I started to think about countering, anti-Muslim narratives with true Muslim history, I quickly learned that actually it starts with enslaved Africans. That as many as 3 million enslaved Africans were Muslim. Came and they weren't just they weren't just people of people of the faith. Some of them were really people of the faith. They were scholars. They were imams. They were they were members of royal caliphate families that had been seized by another empire and now sold into slavery. And so that it seems so obvious to me when I realized it or when I learned it. I was like, oh man, that of course there were Muslim Africans. Of course, West Africa. They came from West Africa. That is like majority Muslim. A huge number of it today is. And that I think that just kind of got me thinking, okay, well, what else don't I know here? And actually, I learned that the history goes back even more. Like Columbus had a Arabic-speaking translator who was sent out to make the first exchange of words with what he thought were South Asian people, but ended up being American indigenous people. So, I mean, those are the sacred words of Islam, Arabic, that were the first words to pass between East and West, which is it's trivia, but it just immediately, for me, it just kind of like shifted my perspective.
Sure.
And so, the first phase of writing this book is to read books and to read as much of it as possible. And the way that I did that was try to find books about certain national or ethnic communities. So the history of Latino Muslims, for example, or just like a book about them, or a book about South Asian Americans. Well, that will have some critical history there. about the first South Asian Muslims who were largely seamen from Bangladesh, who were legally Black, were not allowed to live or have the rights of white Americans. Because they were legally Black, they married Black women, and they created sort of in Harlem, a like Black South Asian Muslim community. Right. I mean, that kind of history, just when it makes my eyes pop, I know that that's something that I want to, try to chase down. And so, once I had that history, that 500-year history, then I started to try to find the regions where where evidence of that history still exists, where I can find at least traces of it, if not landmarks for it. Now, the more recent history, you'll find landmarks for it. You'll the Al Rashid Mosque, for example, or the Nation of Islam in Chicago. But it's the stuff, it's the history of enslaved Africans that is the hardest to pin down. And so the best place to sort of find those traces was Brazil, specifically a city called Salvador, because it was the site of probably the largest Muslim-led revolt in Western history. So that's how I sort of perform that triage. That's how I would pinpoint a certain region. And then a place like Salvador has literally one mosque. That's the mosque. That's the place that's going to be like a time machine for me to move from the past to the present,
right,
and back and forth and back and forth.
Was it always mosques that you were interested in? Was it always the physical space, or would you at some point flirt with, the people, the community? Let me do an analysis of maybe the sociology of a place. I'm curious if landmarks is always the pinnacle.
Yeah, for sure. And like, let's clarify, a mosque is sometimes an oversimplification.
Sure.
It's a better term is probably an Islamic center, because a mosque is not in the West. So here's something that's really unique about mosques or Islamic centers in the West. They are beholden to all the sort of laws and nonprofit laws of Canada, the United States, and they also are serving very often very small minority communities, and those communities need a gathering place to do more than just pray. Life is not just about prayer. Life is about weddings and funerals and daycare and elderly care and counseling services, and it's about playing sports, having like extracurricular sports and having movie nights. And so that, I think, is more representative of what a mosque looks like. It is actually more of like a recreation hall. So that is actually, I hope that comes through in this book.
It does. And you note that that's unique perhaps in the Americas or in the West. Do you feel like that's a component of perhaps how America's kind of shaped Muslims in that sense? Do you feel like that's almost the injection of the vice versa?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Someone much smarter than me at one of my last book events pointed out that the subtitle of the book, How Muslims Shaped the Americas, could easily have been How the Americas Shaped Muslims. And she was bang on. I wouldn't want that subtitle because it kind of robs, a minority community of some autonomy. But, How Muslims Shaped the Americas and How the Americas Shaped Them is actually maybe a more accurate subtitle, because it is about that. And, Islam is a much more amenable religion than people, I think, give it credit for. Even I think a lot of Muslim people don't quite understand just how much it is shaped by the culture of the region where it is being practiced.
I want to pick up on that, and perhaps on the more sort of personal level, because is what you, of course, about you in a second, but also about the people that you talk to in your book, which is one of the undercurrents, at least with a few of your sources and folks that you talk to, is people kind of reclaiming their Muslimness in their own way, like redefining it, as per your previous sort of comment, becoming actors rather than having a community drive a narrative for them, or saying we are this or we do that. I found that fascinating to hear that. But I'm kind of curious, like, did that, kind of come across to you as a process of tension with the communities, or a process of liberation? And I know I don't want you to kind of, once again, a very diverse community, simplify it, but I'm kind of curious, from when you talk to people as they're trying to reclaim their Muslimness in the West, with all these various inputs, maybe a generation or two removed from their parents in certain cases.
I think it's always been a source of tension. I think only now it's becoming a source of tension and liberation. This is a theme that's throughout my book, is that there has, it's part of, I think it stems from a somewhat of an inferiority complex, or a double consciousness that I think a lot of racialized people, minority people, often have to just sort of grapple with themselves. This idea that, this idea that specifically in the context of Islam, that like, we are not practicing Islam the true way, the way that my ancestors practice it, or the way that we used to practice it back home, or, whatever it is. And so there is always kind of this tension of trying to like purify it. And that had always sort of existed, but it became much more prominent and much more, I think, much more divisive in the 70s and 80s and 90s, as propaganda, very, very like well-endowed propaganda campaigns, specifically from Saudi Arabia and other, oil-rich nations that have a very, strict, ultra-Orthodox Islamic practice, where that is sort of like the majority. They were starting to fund mosques and scholars and scholarships, and basically gradually trying to homogenize Islam, or at least Sunni Islam, to look one way. And that just sort of made the tensions that had been there for 100 years much worse. But now I think after September 11th, a lot of millennials, like myself, like yourself, came of age, I think were activated to claim Islam and claim their Muslim identity more on their own terms, to really, have more of a passion for it, and make it work in a way that they believe is authentic to their personal experience. And then you add to that the internet age, and how it has made it possible to access what would be maybe controversial, literature or information, or to access knowledge about other Muslim denominations or other practices that maybe you were never exposed to. Or if you're, say, a queer Muslim, think about how isolating that experience would have been before the internet shows you that there is a community out there, and it connects you to the point now where we have queer-led mosques. That I don't think that could have happened maybe before the internet, before those communities were able to, connect with each other. And I think that is what is, allowing Muslims today, second, third generation, I think that's what's allowing them, giving them maybe the confidence, rather, to claim it on their own terms.
Talk to me about that from your personal perspective, because as much as this is exceptional travel writing, this is part memoir. You talk about yourself and your experience. Talk to me about reclaiming your Muslimness, and from the perspective of, did this book change it while you were talking to others that were kind of going through their own journey?
Yeah.
Have you landed in a different spot, perhaps, than where you started? Or
I think when I started the book, I had already embraced, I don't want to say accepted, embraced the fact that there was still a lot of Muslim values within me, and ethics within me, and even some Muslim pride. But if you were to rewind a few years back, I said earlier how 9/11 kind of it
inflection point, so to speak.
Yeah, it was for a lot of like people coming of age. Well, for all, for generally all Muslim or people from Muslim households in the West. I'll even say people who look Muslim. For Muslim people, for probably the majority, a lot of them felt more compelled to embrace, take pride in that identity, even if they still struggled with the practices themselves and reconciling them with Western values. But there was also, I think, another group, and I consider myself among them, who were sort of jostled in the other direction to distance ourselves from it, to disassociate with it, because that was my way, I think, that was my way of coping. It was also my way of rebelling because I was a teenager and I just had a lot of attitude. And it was, a decade and a bit later when I started to, a decade probably when I started to mellow out. And then a little later when I started to realize the veiled bigotry of a lot of my, sort of previous sentiments.
And it wasn't, if I can ask, Omar, it wasn't like a boomerang back to where you were in childhood and earlier.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
This is sort of a middle point for me because, look, I with or without 9/11, I probably was the kind of person who was gradually moving toward some form of agnosticism or atheism. I think that 9/11 maybe turned it into more of a core identity for me in mostly a negative way. But my beliefs are my beliefs, or rather my disbeliefs are my disbeliefs. I don't think it's outside the realm possibility that there could be a creator, but I don't think that the creator is the Abrahamic God of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. I think that Muhammad was an inspiring leader. I think it is possible that he thought of himself as a genuine prophet, but do I think that he was a prophet of like a singular God? I don't. But through the process of writing this book, I think I was able to appreciate more the positive values that I've absorbed through my Muslim upbringing, and not feel like I have to take everything that I considered everything that was part of being a Muslim person. And I also learned that there are many ways of being a Muslim person, just as there are many ways of being a Jewish person. We are all familiar with the concept of a secular Jew or a cultural Jew. Why that concept does not exist for Muslims, I don't know. But I think that it should, because I think it explains and defines a lot of us who have Muslim experiences, who are part of a Muslim community, who cherish a lot of Muslim values and ethics, but we don't maybe embrace the scripture as the literal word of God, or the idea of God as a literal deity.
To that point, I want to jump into Myrna's question here that she's kind of posed, which is about identity. And she says, we've heard about self-hating Jews, even self-hating Ukrainians for that matter, charges made from their own community members who are furious at what their perceived sort of airing of their dirty laundry, and view themselves as anti-Semites or Islamophobes. Have you been ever kind of accused of self-hatred through this, I shouldn't call it process, but journey, through this journey
not to my face, I wasn't so like open about it. I'm not like Tariq Fatah,
right.
But who has been called to his face a self-hating Muslim. I think I have called him that, at least on Twitter. I think that he's a very sad case, but I also think that maybe a lot of the internalized racism that I think he unintentionally expresses, I think that I used to harbor a lot of that myself as well. Again, no one's ever said that to my face, but have people thought it about me? Almost certainly. Yeah.
Have you, You know, one of the ideas around like Islamic pluralism that I find fascinating is that, of course, there's pluralism between one mosque, one community, one area of the Americas to the next, of course. And I think your book describes that really well. But there's also that subtlety of the pluralism within oneself, right? The multiple hats that we wear as individuals to say, I am just as much 34 as I am Muslim, as I am a male, so to speak, right? To give you a very simplistic.
What does it mean to be 34?
You know, it's wonderful. You should try it sometime.
I have.
You've done it?
Over
great.
it.
You've
Over it.
Now let me tell you about my work with Mitch McConnell. Now, but you know, the reason I bring that up is that there's a term kind of popularized in our current zeitgeist is code switching.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like people being one version of themselves here, and then having to make a hard pivot to be another version of themselves there, versus this harmonization or this reclaiming of one's identity that you talk about, that many folks, yourself included, myself, maybe not to such an extreme degree, if I can call it that, but to a lesser degree and maybe a nuanced degree, kind of go through. It takes a toll on people, on people in terms of how they're trying to say, I need to be version this for my friends, I need to be version Y for my family and for my community. Talk to me about that. Did you?
It's quite liberating to feel a lot more released of that. I mean, part of this book has been partly a little bit of that process. I certainly feel that within like Muslim spaces, I can be maybe a little bit more authentically myself than before. I mean, it is. I mean, it started at a very early age. One of my earliest memories is finding this sort of studio photography studio portrait thing that my mom had kind of forced my brother and I to do as little kids, dressed in like Arabian garbs, headgear and everything, and get these photos. And, I hated doing it. And as soon as it was done, I found that photo. I'm like 5 years old at the time, and I just cut it up in a bunch of pieces and I tried to hide it. And you'd love to see that photo. Good news, my mother did find that photo cut up into a million different pieces, taped it together, and it still exists in the photo album from which I stole it, which is a metaphor on many levels.
Yeah, no kidding.
But I think that's sort of like my earliest memory of being very like hyper aware of the fact that I was kind of living in two worlds.
Yeah.
The world at home where we were very different. I knew that we were very different from the world outside. Nowadays, let me continue that thought for a moment.
Yeah.
I think that, that was something that I think it was something that I tried to sort of conceal a lot, because when you're a child, especially when you're growing up in a small town as I did, without a lot of, other Arab Muslim families, there were a few, so it wasn't completely alien, or our experience wasn't completely alien, but it was mostly pretty alien. So I think when you're growing up in that situation, the only thing you want is to fit in. It's the only thing you want out of life is to be like everyone else. And so at the same time, you want the approval of your parents. You want to be told that you are a good son. So, at home, you're trying to be, I'm stop speaking in second person. I'm trying to be, the good Muslim boy, who impresses his parents by fasting for Ramadan earlier than all their other kids did. And outside, at school, I'm fasting, and I don't want anyone to know I'm fasting. So I'm just telling people I'm hungry. I'm not hungry. I don't want to eat lunch, or, I'm going to another part of the school during lunch just so that I'm not around the food and don't have to explain myself. I am, participating in gym class, having not had any water or food, and and on the edge of fainting, because I just don't want people to know that I have another way of life.
Yeah.
Where, I think that when I kind of rejected my faith. I saw that as sort of the liberation. Oh, now I can just be like everyone
Be-
else now.
Be the outside version of yourself,
Yeah,
with the complete
yeah.
rejection of the home or inside version.
I think so. But I think that was sort of going to another extreme where it was actually kind of hiding a part of maybe hiding a part of me from myself now, you know, instead of trying to hide it from friends or hide it from family, I was kind of hiding it from myself.
Yeah, I want to jump into Michelle's question, which I think is timely from the perspective of kind of your personal identity. How's kind of having your own children affected the way you kind of have looked at this upbringing or this heritage, or frankly, these value systems? Maybe if I can add that to the
that's
mix.
a great question, because it has transformed the way that I see it. Because, you know, before I saw it as a burden, and now I see it as such an enriching experience for my children to have grandparents and aunties and uncles and cousins who have maybe different practices, who speak a different language, who have different foods at home. All I wanted was like for all that stuff to can't we just do things like everyone else? And now I want them to have that, and I want them to have other experiences that are different from what, you know, they might see at their grandparents' house, because that is just so much more enriching. That's just such a more enriching life, and tells you so much more about the world. We're lucky that we live in Canada, where we can, you know, we have a window to the wider world through the multiculturalism of this country. However, high prairie, rural Alberta, it's not really a multicultural place. So I wasn't in a place where I could appreciate the value of being a little bit different and knowing people who were a little bit different from the status quo. Now that I live in a city like Edmonton, I've lived in major cities since I was 17 years old, I can appreciate it a lot more. And I'm so grateful that my kids have the opportunity to live in a neighborhood like Macaulay of Edmonton, where there's just like Ethiopian food and Filipino food, and there's just, they're going to go to school in this neighborhood with a classroom of children who are probably going to represent a dozen different countries. And I think that's fantastic. And they're going to have different religions. They're going to meet other Muslims. They might be Muslims of a denomination that's different from their parents. And when they're old enough to realize it, they might realize that those Muslim kids believe things that are different from their grandparents. But I just think that that's more enriching. And, and I think that there's probably, if you were to ask me 10 years ago, how would I feel if my kids went to mosque with their grandparents or had an interest in Islam, personally, I would probably buckle up and, think that, if not say that, I need to protect them from religion, because religion is dangerous to the, free and intellectual mind. I don't really believe that anymore, not to the extent that I used to. I think it depends on the sort of rigidity of that, religion, or wherever the source of it is anyway. I think now I would be happy if they, at their own personal will, wanted to. I think that it's an opportunity too for them to maybe get closer to their grandparents or cousins, have more in common with them than they otherwise would.
I maybe want to do two more questions for you before we close out, and I know we'll have you do a reading to close us out here. But when you went through these 13 mosques, these 13 places, a story, an anecdote, a place, a community, something that surprised you, knowing in the back of your mind, even mapping it out from saying your triage process, I've got, the history, the timeline, I know where the activity is going to happen. What was the most sort of surprising or most intriguing aspect of your journey?
Oh man, there were so many. I'll just name a bunch of cool experiences I had, because writing this book was such a privilege. I had a lunch meetup with a group in Houston called Muslims of NASA, where I was absolutely the stupidest person at the table. That was kind of cool, talking to a guy who made it.
And that happens often to you, right? I just want to.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yeah, totally. But just the fact that they were smarter than me because they worked at NASA, that was the novelty. No, one of these guys was a big part of making it possible for astronauts to turn astronaut pee into drinkable water, and therefore making it possible, making space travel possible because of that innovation. That was really cool. Having the opportunity to meet the indigenous Maya Muslims of southern Mexico and learn about their incredible journey as a community into through various religions into Islam, a rather sort of cultish Islam, out of it into something that fits their values a little bit more. That was amazing. And they were just the most hospitable people I'd ever met. The opportunity to worship alongside the community in Quebec City and to witness their resilience was quite an experience. The opportunity to go to Dearborn, which you wouldn't think is a cool place, but it's actually it's like Arab American Williamsburg to me.
Yeah,
it was so Michigan. Cool. I loved it. I had so much fun there. I went twice. I had an opportunity to meet Rashida Tlaib at one point. And I'll throw one more, the Unity Mosque in Toronto, though there are Unity mosques all over North America now. It's that queer-led mosque that I was talking about, radically inclusive mosque. The people that I met there, I'll never forget. I mean, many of them were refugees or asylum seekers who were fleeing persecution from their own families, their own governments, and sometimes their own families. One of whom was a lesbian woman from Central Africa who left when her family tried to force her into a heterosexual marriage. And she had so much resentment toward Islam, actually said that she hated Islam until she discovered this mosque that wouldn't just accept her as a member, but would accept her as a leader. And she led prayers. She was my imam. I worshipped behind her, prayed behind her. And that was a profound experience.
That's incredible. These are all incredible stories, all highlighted in this book, folks. Last question I have for you before we leave with the reading from you, Omar, is I want to actually pick up on the question that Janice mentioned here, which we started this conversation from what was the genesis, and at least in part, it was the rise in anti-Islamic sort of rhetoric, Islamophobia. Question Janice poses is how can we as fellow Canadians help counteract the rise of Islamophobia? I'll give the first answer, which is let's buy this book as a start, which is Omar's effort, at least in part in that area. But in all seriousness, Omar, how I know you're not like a policy person in this sense, right? You're a writer, you're documenting your journey, but from your perspective, what have you learned along the way from storytelling and what you've even called this radical inclusivity, which you've just mentioned right now, in terms of using that perhaps terminology or viewpoint to counteracting Islamophobia? And maybe I'll expand it to hate overall in a broader sense.
I think you could. Hate is born out of ignorance, not knowing the other, the other. I don't actually have a lot of hate for hateful civilians, because I think that the forces of propaganda, anti-Muslim propaganda, and the whole industry that benefits from it, I think it's bigger than them. It's a huge and massive force. And what it tries to do is conflate Islam into one nefarious thing and Muslim people as sort of one nefarious thing. And I think that understanding just how vast the definition of a Muslim is, I think that is a pretty good start, to the point where I hope that from reading this book, you're actually maybe confused about what a Muslim is, to the point where you realize that it's so complicated that it is, it's not worth it to make presumptions about what kind of Islam, someone prescribes, or what kind of Muslim a Muslim is. That it might be better off to just, if you're really, really curious and you want to know what their beliefs are, you talk to them, you have a conversation with them. And I think through that process, you'll realize that it is, it is so similar to Christianity or Judaism, but let's say Christianity, because this is the most Christianized landmass, the Americas, to the point where I think it would serve people well to start to think of Islam as a Western religion, or at least a religion that is no less Western than any non-Indigenous faith here. And I think the other thing that would maybe benefit people is to know the history of Muslim people and the Muslim communities in their part of the world, and the contributions that they've made, the influences that they've made. And once you know what to look for, maybe you can start to appreciate that in our society today. And I think the more that you know about a person's history or community's history, again, it's harder to fear them because you can't really fear what you know. So I think that, those would be two things that I hope that, people could sort of educate themselves on. And I think that could go a long way.
I love that answer.
Well, I mean, look, what do you think can be done?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think what's helped us is the striving for representation. And I think the shedding of the burden that if you and I were to speak publicly about anything, that we're not speaking for all Muslims, that this is just another Muslim, right? That as you described yourself as a Muslim atheist, myself as an Ismaili Muslim, it's one of many hats we wear, right? It's one of many hats. But if you want to just be like, oh, look, here's the Muslim representation, it'd be like, well, here's the white representation, or here's the Christian representation from what we see. It doesn't work, right? So I think from the perspective of, and I think our communities, plural, have understood this. There's many projects, including an upcoming Netflix show, which I'm not sure if you've heard of, which is, was all about trying to get Muslims in communities, including this series that found the most Trump voting county in a state that had the most, also had like a large Muslim population. And they did it like an experiment over a course of a year, which was, if this Muslim community could just fan out their wings more than they had before, like just get to know us, right? And they kind of measured Islamophobia through a variety of different metrics, and it went down. And it kind of shed this now modern myth that we may like to tell ourselves, that people have calcified in a certain direction, that there's no penetration, we're too polarized to get through with any facts. It might be true in a certain degree, but there are still spots where I think we can kind of make this progress. So, I think getting to know is at the core of it, right? You cannot fear the other if the other is not the other in many ways. If they're just like you, if they're just as diverse and complicated and as normal and as textured and cultured as you or someone I think that's at the heart of any of these quote unquote strategies around combating Islamophobia in the short and the long term. I mean, the more complicated and less complicated simultaneous answer is better legislation. We don't want to go down that road, but that's part of it. Like hate speech online, like all those sort of things, that stuff all matters. But as it relates to citizenry, I think it's that outreach and that storytelling and the getting to know and having an orbit that is much more textured, diverse, and radically inclusive.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for illuminating that. I think that one of the challenges isn't so much that there are, maybe there's divisiveness within Muslim communities, that might prevent them from getting out there to do that kind of outreach. But I think it's the way that we often feel burdened to do the outreach.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
As opposed to welcomed. And so what I'm getting at is, there's there's this off sort of like refrain where like, it's not my job to apologize for Muslims. It's not my job to like speak for all Muslims. Obviously, it's not. But at the same time, if you do care about changing perspectives, and if you do care about quelling the tides of hate, and you feel like you are in a position, whether because of your status or just because of your personality, where you're in a position to, you know, educate people on on the reality of Muslim experiences, or at least your Muslim experience, and to sort of counteract narratives. And if you do see an opportunity where you are actually welcomed to, maybe speak to the reality of your Muslim life, that, I think for Muslim people, it would be, I think more times than not, it's better to sort of accept that opportunity to do it. I get that it can be exhausting, but sometimes it is, I don't want to say it's a duty, but sometimes it is a good opportunity that does could have a positive contribution on one person's perspective, and that person might have might help change someone else's perspective for the positive as well. So,
do you want to close us out with the final reading?
Let's do it. I'm going to try to. I am going to read from something a little bit more, lighthearted, I guess, than the last one, but something that takes us out on a more positive note. I'm going to read to you from A Tale of Two Mosques, which is a chapter about the Al Rashid in Edmonton and the first mosque in America in Ross, North Dakota. So I'll read from the Edmonton part. I know that man. 79-year-old Richard Awad pivoted his walking cane toward the voice. He instantly recognized the gold-trimmed train conductor hat and gold-breasted suit. "Bill," said Awad, a big smile under his glasses resting on the tip of his nose. They shook hands outside Fort Edmonton Park, a wormhole through time to the western frontier. Bill was the Living Museum steam train conductor who usually shuttled tourists back and forth between the fur trading era and the Roaring '20s. However, all that summer, the train had been in maintenance, leaving Bill with little to do but hand out walking maps around the entrance, surrounded by gaggles of kids being advised by chaperones not to harass the goats and turkeys, also kept inside. The two men haven't seen each other since Awad's wife, Soraya, fell ill in 2015, and he quit volunteering as a historical interpreter to take care of her. I knew all of this not only because Richard Awad and Soraya's Zaki Hafez are my relatives through marriage, but because they're legendary in the Arab community. They helped get Edmonton's Al Rashid Mosque historical designation, making it the country's only Islamic heritage site and launching a 14-year effort to save it from the wrecking ball. Back when Awad, a retired teacher, volunteered at the park, he wouldn't have been teaching European settler history in tweed hats and suspenders like most of the costumed interpreters there. You'd have found him at the Al Rashid Mosque, the first Muslim house of worship built in Edmonton, and since moved to be carefully preserved on this grassy knoll. It is the last stop of the outdoor museum before the boardwalk curves into a midway, the main attraction for the children racing inside the park. We followed them, entering as we would eventually exit through the gift shop, past old-timey confection and toys before the old friends parted ways. Awad led me to the mosque for a private tour like the ones he used to offer, salary-free for 200 hours every summer. Along the way, he greeted costumed former colleagues who briefly broke character to make small talk with him. I recognized them too from a decade prior. My wife put herself through college as a historical interpreter, donning a bustle and a gown in the role of Miss McDonald, which isn't very far from her Scottish roots. For our first few dates, she invited me to the after-hours staff parties, infamous for drunken dandies climbing the Palisades and couples sneaking off to historical landmarks. The train, Bill, I'm sorry, was very popular. The mosque was perhaps the only place considered off-limits. Al Rashid is widely understood as the park's most culturally sensitive landmark. Awad's wife, Soraya Hafiz, was at the forefront of a contentious campaign to display the mosque in Fort Edmonton. It was moved there from its original site in 1992, but only after 3 years of politicking and petitioning for its preservation. The museum board fought the inclusion of the mosque based on an arbitrary vision of local history that began in 1846 with the fur trade and ended in 1920 with the metropolitan era. They weren't open-minded enough to realize the value of it, but I've always preached that this is part of Edmonton's history, part of Alberta's history, and part of Canada's history, said Awad. Besides the cane and long shoehorn that he used to swap at wasps, Awad was wearing basically the same outfit he always wore to teach tourists about Muslim and Arab Canadian history, a plaid shirt and gray cardigan. It seems that I am in his uniform today. Visitors to the mosque might have expected to meet a man in gold-threaded robes and a swirling fez, but his wardrobe would more accurately resemble the getup of Edmonton's first Imam James, Lebanese property developer who was elected to lead prayers because few else could recite Quran as well. You didn't need a religious person to lead prayer back then. You could nominate someone from the community who was knowledgeable, Awad explained. His own father, Ahmed Awad, was certainly pious enough to qualify to lead prayers, but he wasn't even involved in teaching Awad how to pray. He'd arrived in 1901 from Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Ahmed Awad was running from Ottoman army conscription at the time. His time in Canada was supposed to be temporary, but success as a traveling salesman gave him reason to stay. Ahmed's story is a common one. By the early 1900s, peddling had become a way of life for Arab bachelors. They usually started in Montreal or New York, working for some warehouse or factory operated by Christian Syrians who had gained mercantile experience back home. Muslims, however, often migrated from rural areas and lacked any of the connections their employers would have made at Sunday Mass. The Christian felt much more comfortable and at home, explained Awad, whereas the Muslim was more on his own. He becomes a peddler, putting packs on his back, walking around to make a living, moving out westward to small communities that needed stuff. I'll leave it there, but with a little tidbit. There's still a modern version of the Lebanese peddler that you may have seen on, say, Fort Road or 97th Street. If you can picture that van with the Bob Marley flags on it, the cannabis blanket, the Tupac blanket, the Minions flag, all that, like, you know, there's like a Louis Vuitton flag. Yes, okay, you've seen it. There are a number of these people who do this. They're all Lebanese. These are the modern day peddlers. They go from, you see them in Edmonton, you wonder, how do they make a living? Well, I'll tell you, they actually travel from small town to small town. Usually when there's like a county fair or something like that, they set up shop and they sell their kitsch. So anyway, little bit of trivia there. The Lebanese peddler still exists.
I love it. Praying to the West, How Muslims Shape the Americas. Omar Mouallem, my brother, congratulations on the book. Make sure you get it, folks. Audrey's Books, Glass Bookshop. Thank you to Simon & Schuster. Thank you to Starfest. Michelle, I'll throw it over to you if you've got any final comments for the fine folk.
Okay, well, my first comment is, can you guys just come once a week and just go online and chit chat for us? Because this was really nice. I just did a quick check, you know, when you're talking about, you know, you don't fear what you know. All 12 copies of your book are checked out right now from our library with holds on them.
So, more copies than the Edmonton Public Library has, I would like to tell you.
So, but it shows you people want to learn. I actually got my hold yesterday, finally. So that's going to be my weekend reading. Anyways, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I got to do a few other thank yous. Stephanie, you did a great job behind the scenes, collecting everybody's questions. I need to thank our funders, our main funders, the City of St. Albert, with the Friends of the St. Albert Public Library, Alberta Foundation for the Arts, Canada Council for the Arts, and our media sponsors, the St. Albert Gazette, T8N Magazine, and Edify Magazine. Everyone will get a survey at the end of the festival with a chance to win a set of the Starfest books, including Praying to the West. So we really want to know what you thought about the events that you'd seen, and also who you'd like to see at next year's Starfest. So our next event is tomorrow afternoon at 2, features historical fiction author Genevieve Graham in conversation with a Starfest alumna, Eleanor Florence. And you can get tickets for that at starfest.ca. We still have a week's worth of Starfest events, but this was pretty fantastic. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Zain. And I'm going to say goodnight to everybody. I have a book to read. So
Thanks.
bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Zain.